Welcome to Mindcrime Liberty Show with me, Swithun Dobson, and him, Patton. Today we are joined by Gabb to discuss libertarian strategy. For those who don't know, Gabb is the author of more than 40 books, including 8 historical novels under the pen name Richard Blake. He holds a PhD in English history and is the former director of the Libertarian Alliance. He is currently the director of the Centre of Ancient Studies, which provides tuition in both Latin and Greek. Thank you for taking the time to join us, Sean.
Thank you for having me, Swithun.
So, libertarian strategy, which you have written on in the past. So, my first question to you is, in brief, what do you think are the main failings of the strategies adopted by libertarians, let's say from the World War II period? Why have they failed?
Well, that's a decidedly loaded question, isn't it? Unfortunately, I have no objection to it. If you'd asked me what do you think has been the biggest success of libertarian strategy, I would have to restrain myself from laughing out loud. Libertarian strategy has been a comprehensive failure, even when the objective circumstances might have been in our favour. We still made a total mess of it. Let me tell you what the strategy has been. The strategy has been to focus on economic analysis. There are reasons for that. Probably most libertarians come to the ideology through economics. Many of us are captivated by the realization that that society is a spontaneous, self-ordering organism, and we look at the economic analysis and then just apply it wider and wider until we've become radical free market libertarians. And since that's how we came into the ideology, not me necessarily, but that's how we came into the ideology, we assume that that is the path by which others can be brought in. And I can see the temptation, because economic analysis is largely a set of, let's not use the phrase self-evidently true propositions, but let's say that it is a set of internally consistent propositions which follow from certain first principles, the nature of which again I'll leave undiscussed. Whereas unfortunately, most people are not interested in economics, and even if they are willing to accept the validity of certain economic arguments, these economic arguments can be detached from the overall analysis and applied to a generally statist view of the world. Now you saw this in the 1980s. Many of us thought, if we can just persuade the Thatcher government to privatize the telephone network, that will surely get the libertarian ball rolling. Well, no, it didn't. There are sound reasons. There are sound statist reasons for privatizing the telephone network. The system runs much better when it's managed by various crony capitalists than it is run directly by the state. And so libertarians increasingly became efficiency experts for the state without realizing. Now, that is the positive mistake that libertarians have made, assuming that arguing about economics would win the argument. And it manifestly hasn't. There are libraries of libertarian writings on economics. There may be 10,000 years worth of videos on YouTube, all about the joys of the free market, produced by libertarians. And it doesn't matter how good the material is, it just doesn't have much impact. Our positive failure has been to ignore those things which do have a wider resonance, and that is the culture. I remember having an argument with a group of slightly older libertarians than I was at the time. This is in the mid-1980s. And they kept insisting that as long as we could squeeze the tax rates down, as long as we could privatise this, that and the other, one more big privatisation, and that would make the libertarian revolution unstoppable. And I pointed out that the latest criminal justice bill takes away the right to silence. It takes away the right to peremptory challenge of jurors. And I was brushed aside. No, that's nonsense. Law is just superstructure. You change the economic base and the superstructure will automatically change. They didn't use quite that language, but if I had put it into those terms, they might not have disagreed. A later realization I made was that law, although law is at least as important as economics, law and economics themselves are the superstructure. The base, as far as most things are concerned, is the culture. If people watch morally degrading trash, they will tend to accept. Let's not accuse people of accepting morally degrading ideologies of human organisation. Let us say they will tend to adopt more authoritarian views of human organisation, and that is largely what happened. If you look at British popular culture until the late 1970s, it was genuinely diverse in the political sense. You had people of very great private and public importance, like Kenneth Williams. He's mostly known simply for his performances in the Carry On films, but he was a man of great private influence, and he could make or break careers. And he was, to put it very mildly, a very staunch conservative. You can go through many other people in British popular culture who were conservatives. And so there was not necessarily a libertarian cultural input in Britain at this time, though I think there was, but there was a diversity of voices, and conservatism was a valid part of the culture. In the early 1980s, the cultural leftists took over culture. That's why they're called cultural leftists. And they purged it. They got rid of, you're probably too young to remember these things, but the Crossroads, a soap opera. Rather low production values, but solid Toryism throughout. That they got rid of Benny Hill, because although he wasn't necessarily a conservative, he wasn't a leftist. Kenneth Williams found that he was no longer quite so welcome as he had been. And so it went on, the purging of conservatives from culture, the rise of leftists. Let me think of them. Oh, there's Ben Elton, I suppose. He's a good example. Joe Brand, who managed to get Carol Thatcher bounced off the BBC some years ago. All of these alternative comedians, some of which, I mentioned Joe Brand, are actually persons of considerable talent and even a degree of honesty, but leftists. And then they got hold of light entertainment in general, and the most obvious outcome of that was EastEnders. And although I haven't watched an episode of EastEnders for 20 years, and I haven't seen an episode of Coronation Street since 1977, I do pay some attention to what is being said about them. Oh, and The Archers on BBC Radio 4. My friend Robert Henderson still listens to it and sends me summaries of the plot lines. These are all solidly leftist. And you see, for every person who might be inclined to open human action. Let's not talk about those who might read it through to the end and consider its contents. For every one person who opens a copy of Human Action, there must be 10,000 who sit down in the evening to watch EastEnders. And all around us, even as in the early 90s we celebrated the fall of communism and the apparent triumph of global free market economics, we had lost the cultural war. And the first result of that was the Major government, which morphed seamlessly into the Blair government, and I'm afraid it's been downhill all the way ever since. And if I were in America, I could probably tell the same story about the takeover of Hollywood, about the corruption of television entertainment, about the capture of newspapers. And we have comprehensively failed as a movement even to consider that culture is important. And most of us, I'm afraid, although we could put up some very good economic arguments for all sorts of policies, most of us are deaf and blind to culture itself. And so if I had a shed load of money to spend on promoting libertarianism, I would not set up an institute with a bright young man in charge of it on £80,000 a year. What I would do is commission a ballet about the early life of Ludwig von Mises, or perhaps an opera based on with a libretto based on one of the works of Ayn Rand. Do something like that. It sounds rather comical, but the reason it sounds comical is because it hasn't so far been done or even considered. Think of all those cantatas, all those paintings, all of those plays which celebrate the life and times and the works of Karl Marx or Lenin or any other socialist luminary. And some of these are worthless, but some of them are extraordinarily good, and they've had much more effect than those great big heavy slabs of books that Marx and Engels put out. So if you want me to summarize why have we failed, we've been barking up the wrong tree, assuming that the great masses out there were moved by the same kinds of argument or the same kinds of approach to those arguments as we ourselves found useful when we were young, whereas that is most decidedly not the case.
That's interesting. I think it's unarguable that there's been a leftist takeover since at least the 1980s in the culture. But the interesting question, I think, here is, why did these sort of artists, in a broad sense, why were they leftists? And then how did they then come to decide to change the culture? What I'm getting at here is a more general question, which is, what do you think is the major driver of cultural change? Is it ideas? Is it sort of downstream from philosophy? Is it genetics? Is it technology? What would you say, or economics, although you said that's probably untrue to some extent. What do you think it is sort of like the major driver of cultural change?
I'm not very good here at monocausal explanations. It's everything that you've mentioned and probably a few others that you haven't mentioned. All of those things more or less came together in the 1980s. But let's have a look at it from an artistic point of view. Do you think Margaret Thatcher was particularly interested in music and literature? I think the question answers itself. I know that Norman Tebbit wasn't, because I've discussed the matter with him. His answer to me when I raised these points was, we were sorting out the unions and inflation. We didn't have time to cover the whole spectrum, and I'm sorry if we messed up in that respect. But back in the 1980s, the Thatcherites and most of their libertarian hangers-on were self-conscious Philistines, whereas the leftists, they were not. They were interested in the arts, partly because they were Gramscians. They had bought into the idea of cultural reproduction as a means of creating ideological hegemony. And what I remember is I can't say I pay a huge amount of attention to cultural matter, to popular culture at least. But I think in about 1986, maybe a year either side, there was a film release called My Beautiful Laundrette, which is an interracial gay romance stroke comedy. And it's an extraordinarily clever film. It's also a very good film, in my view. What it does is it has a strong and broadly comic script, which includes all manner of sometimes values which I would sometimes call generally libertarian, but often with a cultural leftist turn to them. And this film was seen as so important that Neil Kinnock, the leader of the Labour Party, turned up to its premiere. How many films in the 1980s had Conservative politicians turning up to their premieres? Maybe a few with fellow travelling leftist Conservatives, but nothing like that. And I would suggest that films like My Beautiful Laundrette had a great deal more effect on changing public opinion than any number of those extraordinarily worthy and, of course, unreadable Adam Smith reports on privatising the cracks between the paving stones. So, coming back to the main point. If you're an artist in pure terms, you want funding, because although people do create without any prospect of money, it is nice to have a patron. And the biggest patron is and always has been the state. And if the means of state patronage have been taken over by a particular group of people, then the artists will follow the opinions of those people in much the same way as putting a magnet underneath a paper covered with iron filings will automatically produce a certain arrangement of iron particles. And so artists, educators, intellectuals in general will be drawn to statist doctrines because, as I said, the state is and always has been and perhaps always will be the greatest patron around. And if the means of distribution of state patronage have been monopolized by a certain group of people, then artistic production will change to reflect the preferences of those people. Sorry, do I make myself clear?
Yes, that's very clear. Could you pinpoint a time or when sort of classical liberals or conservatives ceased to have as much interest in the arts? Is there a sort of a definable time period when they were sort of patrons and sort of generally interested in it, and then sort of like became sort of self-conscious Philistines, as it were?
It's there's no defining moment as far as I can tell. Well, actually there might be, but it was generally a slow process. If you look at British popular culture circa 1910, it was broadly Tory. Of course, we tend to look back on the works of H.G. Wells, his social novels in particular. Not everyone reads them much nowadays, and the works of John Galsworthy, and Bernard Shaw and so on. But this was a particular cluster of artistic producers. If you look at people, most whose names have vanished from memory, there was a broadly Tory popular culture. And this held up through the 20s and 30s. I suppose if you want a defining moment when it shifted, you would come to the film version of Love on the Dole, released in 1941. If you look at almost any of the non-escapist films made during the Second World War, they're all looking forward to a bright socialist future. And if you look at plays like, An Inspector Calls, yes, that's a good example, isn't it? An Inspector Calls. It's pushing socialism. And so it goes on. Now, you could say that there was a slight Tory revival in the 1950s. If you look at many of the British films made in that decade, you do see non-leftist values. It's just that this ran out of steam in the 60s. And certainly since the 1980s, British popular culture, indeed British culture of virtually every kind, is dominated by the left, dominated by the cultural leftists, not by people who believe in nationalising the means of production, but by people who certainly have got their claws into the means of cultural production, and who are using that in order to ensure ideological reproduction across the generations. And you see, for the most part, conservatives and libertarians were not aware of this in the 1980s or 90s or the hundreds. When I brought my book, Cultural Revolution, Culture War, out in 2007, there were some perfectly sound libertarians who thought I'd gone mad because the whole thing was about culture. There has been a more general recognition of the importance of culture since about 2010, but it's one thing to realize you're losing when you're still on both feet with your fists raised. It's not terribly good when you're lying flat on your back being given a repeated good hard kicking, is it?
Indeed. On the culture matter, would you say there are any sort of particular art forms which are more influential than others? Or would you say that it doesn't particularly matter as to what the cultural artifact is? They are sort of equally as influential. What I'm thinking here is obviously mass market ones are kind of culturally kind of more influential, for example, like EastEnders. But are there other art forms of like TV or film or whatever which the creators of things like EastEnders, etc., would watch and be influenced by, and then would then alter their artworks accordingly? I'm thinking on a strategic line here, because if it was the case that there was one or particular forms which were more important than others in sort of the filtering down, then it might be prudent to suggest producing more works in that line rather than trying to go mass market originally, which may fail or it may work. But
there's good news and bad news here. Probably the most important means of cultural reproduction is television entertainment. And I may be wrong because I'm horribly out of date since I don't watch television, but I think the most important of these is the soaps like EastEnders, those have been taken over. The only thing that you could do with them if you became Director General of the BBC would be to shut them down. They are beyond, I was about to say they're beyond reform, but you see, you reform things when they have ceased to operate as they should, whereas EastEnders manifestly operates as it should, or it did the last time I watched it. And they are expensive things to produce, and they are very well written, very well acted, very well produced, and none of us has anything remotely approaching the kind of budget to compete with those. And so the most influential means of cultural reproduction is television entertainment, and there is nothing we can do to break into that. The good news is that the high arts promoted by the cultural leftists are, for various reasons, generally worthless. Their own efforts are worthless. If you take poets like Carol Ann Duffy or Andrew Motion or whoever the current poet laureate is, I've forgotten his name, though I did write an attack on him last year. What they are writing is trash. And if you look at the most lauded artists, people like Tracy Emin, Damien Hirst, what they are producing is, well, it's not so much trash as a fraud on the taxpayer. And very few people look at this and enjoy it, or there is a degree of false consciousness going on. People know that it's worthless, but they feel obliged to admire it because everybody else does. Perhaps not false consciousness, more like the emperor's new clothes. And I'm not saying it's easy to produce oil paintings or symphonies or epic poems or indeed novels, but those are individual creations, and those people with the necessary talent and also of the right philosophical inclinations are operating on something like a level playing ground. Not entirely level, because as I keep on saying, the state is the biggest patron of the arts, and if you are a self-consciously conservative in both the philosophical and the artistic sense, conservative, you will not receive any patronage except maybe by accident. But at least you can produce your artworks and put them out there. Whereas if you are a conservative or libertarian television producer or script writer, there is no real opening for you. And so we do have an opening at the level of the non-televisual arts, the traditional art forms.
That makes sense.
It's not all doom and gloom, but we must accept that we are not currently in a very good position.
Tim, what have you got to say on this?
Your co-host on the Libertarian Alliance, I forget if he's co-host, the name is escaping me. You're rather critical of cultural philistinism, and a lot of libertarians actually tend to be outright Philistine libertarians. Because I hear a story. The story you just told is very common amongst like Christian conservatives, Protestant conservatives, Catholic conservatives, and many of them will actually blame capitalism or libertarians as the driver of this kind of trash culture that exists. Where does your analysis differ from your standard Catholic conservative, your standard Protestant conservative? Because they sometimes blame us or libertarians. Do you just say that there's false class consciousness? Do do you say that people just have worse taste? How do you differ from that? And thirdly, they'll also say that's just a rise in atheism. That's the story they generally tell me. So how do you differ in your analysis?
Well, there's no necessary association of atheism with bad art. If you look at Soviet art, and I'm not talking simply about the visual arts, I'm talking about music and poetry and film. If you look at socialist realism, especially what was being produced during the tyranny of Stalin, it is of astonishingly high quality. I've spent quite a while listening to the music produced in Germany during the Third Reich, and with one or two exceptions, it's mediocre. Whereas, of course, there's an enormous amount of mediocrity in Soviet music, but you do have undoubted men of genius like Dmitri Shostakovich, Sergei Prokofiev, and a few other people. And so there's no necessary connection between atheism and Philistinism, and certainly atheists do not always produce or commission bad art. Have libertarians contributed to the impoverishment of the arts? Only so far as one or two of us might have a particular talent which we have chosen not to develop or exercise. I'm afraid we have been of so little importance in the cultural sense that we cannot be blamed for what's happened. Except in the negative sense that when conservatives, vaguely defined, who might have given an ear to some degree of libertarianism, when those people were not necessarily in charge, but at the top of the state machinery, they did nothing to shake the cultural domination of the leftists. And so it is a sin not of commission, but of omission. Conservatives with a large C were in power in this country continuously from 1979 to 1997. And for part of that time, the left saw itself and probably was on the back foot. And just as the Conservatives were able to destroy the trade union movement, and just as they were able to privatize and revitalize many of the commanding heights of the economy, they could, had they been so inclined, have done something about artistic patronage. Instead, they left it to people who were their sworn enemies, and who would eventually undo even the limited amount of good work that they did in their 20 years in power, 18 years rather. So don't blame us, because we were never that important. Blame the mainstream conservatives because they didn't understand where the real battlefront was, and they were overwhelmed from the rear eventually. Let me develop that. Right up until the Iraq War, I know people who were in the Conservative Party, and they kept assuring me that the Labour government was run by unreconstructed socialists, and that sooner or later they would get round to renationalising British Telecom. And of course they weren't, because cultural leftists are not interested in socialism. Jerry Corbyn, it was a decided throwback because he did believe in old-fashioned socialism. And one of the reasons he was so hated in the Labour Party was not his alleged anti-Semitism, which I don't believe at all, but because he wanted to undo the economic order from which they themselves so plainly benefited. An economic order which they had done much to bring into being.
No, that makes sense. Changing tack slightly from culture, I think you've made a powerful case for libertarians to be involved in culture and changing things from the ground up. I was wondering what you thought of newer sort of libertarian methods, such as the startup society people, so something like the seasteaders, the free private cities, and all the intentional community type people. Do you think that has any more traction than an economic focused influence of the current government, or do you think they just won't get support in sufficient numbers to make any difference?
I think so far as they begin to be successful, they'll be shut down. Let us suppose that a group of hardcore libertarians were to take over the government of, let's think of somewhere, let's say Panama, a place which I know very little. Let's suppose that a group of hardcore libertarians were to take over the government of Panama. The country would be invaded, just as it was indeed 30 years ago, because Panama didn't do that much about money laundering and tax evasion. And so, I like the idea of Liberland, which exists in a little pocket of disputed territory in the Balkans. It's largely tolerated because it exists underneath the radar. The moment it starts to attract population, the moment it acquires a free market banking system, which begins to get the attention of people who don't want their money stolen from them, then I've no doubt that Liberland would be shut down by the stroke of a pen. Seasteading, all of these things, every square inch of this planet is possessed by states. And you may say, well, no, legally speaking, the oceans are terra nullius. Yes, they are at the moment, but the moment they become valuable, or simply the moment the users of the oceans become a nuisance, then they will cease to be terra nullius, and anything that causes trouble will be shut down. I think that one of the delusions which has beset libertarians and conservatives in my lifetime, at least, in my lifetime since I came out as libertarian at least, is that with a bound we can be free. Whereas I don't think it's anywhere near so easy. If we want to create any kind of momentum which will take us to victory, as we might loosely define it, we're not in the position of the Bolsheviks in 1914, who needed to wait for a particular state to fail and then step in and take over its functions. We're in much the same position as the apostles were after the crucifixion, sitting around in Jerusalem wondering what to do next. And let us leave aside all matters of divine intervention and religious truth. Christianity succeeded because Paul of Tarsus turned up saying, I've got a brilliant idea. I'm going to evangelize the Gentiles. And he disappeared and I believe spent 20 years wandering around the Greek cities of Asia Minor and the Greek mainland, setting up little Christian communities which were of limited importance and certainly which were not taken seriously by the authorities. And over the next few centuries, Christianity grew and grew. And it grew and grew for various reasons. One of those reasons was that Christians tended to stick together, that there was a common feeling between Christians. It meant that if there was a barbarian raid on one of the coastal cities on the Black Sea, and large numbers of slaves were taken off to be sold, the priests would turn up buying back the Christians. And if there was a plague and the doctors ran away and people lay suffering in their homes, Christians would turn up and nurse them. If you joined a Christian community, I won't refer to the church because that's perhaps a little previous, but if you belonged to a Christian community, you could count on the unwavering support of your fellows, and you were expected to give unwavering support to your fellows. And it also meant that if you travelled from one end of the empire to the other, you would find like-minded people, and after a brief examination of your credentials, you would receive and be expected to give unwavering support in your new home. And as these communities grew, they began to throw up men of genius, men like Tertullian, Origen, Cyprian, and so it goes on. And insensibly, by working from the bottom up, Christianity became an important force within the empire, despite several half-hearted persecutions, until eventually it did take over. And it was a long process. Now, I rather hope that it would not take quite as long as 275 years from the beginning of a movement until its complete triumph, as happened with Christianity. But if conservatives and libertarians want to make a difference, if they want to create a movement which will last beyond their own lifetimes and which will grow almost by its own gathering mass, forget asking some money bags to hand over £90,000 a year to run an institute of cultural studies or something. Instead, do business with each other. We all, when I say we, I'm assuming for the moment that we are broadly middle class. Not necessarily the case, but we are broadly middle class. We employ window cleaners, builders, painters, decorators. We find dentists. We find hairdressers. And what we should be doing is trying to find hairdressers and builders and plumbers and decorators who broadly share our values. You don't call in a window cleaner and interrogate him on his views of the non-aggression principle, but you try to make sure not to employ somebody who has bought into the existing consensus. And we don't do that. We don't do that at all. Another thing is to give and to expect unwavering support. Now, there's something that has always struck me, or struck me ever since I've read about it. Some years ago, a young Muslim stopped his car and went into a mosque to to perform his duties. And when he came out, he found his car had been clamped. And he had an argument with the clampers, and they said that unless he paid them £100, they would tow the car away. So he got into the car and shut the door. You can't tow away a car that is occupied. And many other people came out from the mosque and from the general community, and without threatening violence or anything untoward, they gave that young man complete moral support over the next 24 hours, bringing him cups of tea, meals, and generally behaving in a supportive manner, while the clamping company added more and more fines. Until eventually the clampers began to panic, and they promised that if he gave them a derisory sum of money, they would just take off the clamp and go away. And that's what happened. Now, you and I are libertarians, or we are what we are. I'm not sure how you define yourself, but if that happened to me, how many libertarians could I bring out on a Friday afternoon to give me that degree of moral support? Even if we were having, even if I'd parked outside a place where we were having a conference, how many fellow libertarians could I count on to give me that degree of support? Could I count on myself to give that degree of support to somebody else? And that's a question that we should ask whenever we consider why we are not terribly successful.
It is certainly something we should think more about, although it is quite difficult when we're somewhat geographically dispersed and don't have a huge number of us at present. But certainly trying to build networks like that is going to be important.
Yes, and it's not networks of people who turn up on a Friday evening to someone's flat and sit on a stained carpet discoursing on the non-aggression principle, because that doesn't seem to go anywhere. I've watched this. I've been part of it for 30 years. And it was no more successful at the end than it was at the beginning. It is a question of seeking out and making connections and maintaining those connections with people whose views are broadly aligned with your own. It doesn't mean that you must agree with people in every jot and tittle. It simply means that you should be giving a broad preference to people who broadly count as your own. And how many of us do that? I try it, but I don't try it with much consistency.
I think a possible issue that you could rally people behind is those people who are against the lockdown. Most of those people seem generally okay and would probably agree on many things. Not all of them, but that's certainly possible. I see that a bit as a touchstone issue. If you're against it, you're generally okay, in my view.
Yes, indeed. But okay, let's discuss the lockdown, as it's the biggest event of our lives, and it's still going on, and it won't go away. I have no principled objection to the lockdown. If we were facing a rerun of something like the Black Death, which killed between 40 and 60% of the human population, and if we were as naked against it as doctors in the 14th century were, then yes, you go for a lockdown. You try to you put everyone into quarantine while you try to work out what to do next. The only question is to what extent the lockdown has been a wise and proportionate response to the threat posed by the coronavirus. And this is not a matter of principle, it's a matter of fact. At the moment, it does seem as though it was an unwise and disproportionate response. But you see, it is by no means certain, and although I'm very good at many things, and although I'm even reasonably good at epidemiology, the deep science behind all of these arguments is somewhat beyond me. I have a strong feeling, but based on a lifetime of experience of public health panics, that the coronavirus will go away. And it might come back a bit, it might hang around a bit, but it's unlikely to sweep away multitudes, and that it is likely come September to be dawningly realized that that crashing the economy and taking a straight 35% off GDP was not perhaps the best way to go about this. But you see, this is an argument that is still going on, and I certainly don't claim to have anything approaching full information. I have a strong suspicion that this is not the proportionate response, but I may be wrong, and it may be that after the first wave has receded, there will be a second wave which does kill 20, 30, 60, 100 million people throughout the world. In which case you might argue, well, if we hadn't crashed the economy in a worthless lockdown for the first wave, we might have we might now not be on the edge of economic collapse and actual starvation. But I'm not sure that we can. I'm not sure that we can build any kind of momentum on anti-lockdown protests, because it is based on a set of scientific and medical arguments in which most of us have no particular expertise.
My point wasn't necessarily that it on the specifics of the lockdown as such, but rather the people who have been generally more skeptical seem to be of relatively sound mind, non-hysterical, and have a healthy skepticism of the ruling authorities.
Ah, yes. Okay.
That was more my... they do tend to go in that direction, and they have been better than many quasi-libertarian groups, which I won't name, in that respect as well. So we're coming up to time now. So Sean, if there are any libertarian Philistines listening, which of your own books would you recommend that which of your novels would you recommend that they read? The novel that I most enjoyed writing, because it only took about 6 weeks, is The Break, a futuristic dystopian novel involving a time slip of the mainland UK to 1064. That hasn't done anywhere near as well as my mainstream historical novels, but it's a novel for which I have a great deal of affection, and if I could sell a few dozen of them on the back of this interview, I'd be delighted. And if anyone wants to find anything else about your work, where is best to find that?
Oh, my main website, which is www.seangabb.co.uk. There's a lot there. Some of it, well, most of it was written in a great hurry, and perhaps some of it shouldn't have been published, but I'm too lazy or too vain to go through it, taking stuff down that might nowadays be embarrassing to me.
Thank you for your time, Sean, and your insightful answers. And if any of the listeners would like to get into contact with us about comments about the show or any topics we should cover, please contact us at mindcrimelibertyshow@gmail.com. That is mindcrimelibertyshow@gmail.com. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you.